Welcome to the South Ops Fire Weather Webcast for Wednesday, October 2nd. I'm your host, Kristen Stewart. Due to strong high pressure and light offshore flow, the marine layer has become much more shallow as compared to earlier this week. There are only low clouds covering a small part of the south coast and are not extending past the immediate coastline. It will be another fabulously sunny day across the state of California, though there are some monsoonal high clouds in the deserts. The downside is that it's going to remain very hot away from the beaches, and that does not seem to want to go away anytime soon. Just like the past few days, surface observations are indicating weak offshore flow over the higher terrain of central and southern California. Offshore pressure gradients remain very weak, and there's very little upper-level wind support to enhance surface winds, so we're only seeing localized north to east winds gusting 15 to 25 miles an hour at most. These light offshore winds will support continued hot temperatures and a very dry air mass that will lead to enhancement of fire danger. The light offshore flow and continued strong high pressure will support a few more degrees of warming across the region today, and it will likely be the hottest day of the period and the peak of the heat wave. Highs today will be in the mid-80s to low 90s across the lower mountain elevations, upper 90s to 110 degrees in the valleys and high desert, and 105 to 115 in the low desert. These values are quite impressive for October, considering that climatologically temperatures should begin their downward trend. These temperatures are in many cases 15 to 20 degrees above normal for this time of year, and there is no surprise that there will likely be record highs broken. There is a chance that some inland areas may break the record high temperature ever observed in the month of October since records began. As a result of the significant late season heat, much of the region is under heat advisories or excessive heat warnings. This heat wave continues to be driven by a strong ridge of high pressure nudging into the west coast from the Pacific. That ridge will remain overhead today, then weaken just slightly and shift over the desert southwest by the end of this week, where it will remain into next week. As the ridge axis shifts eastward, inland areas will gradually cool around 8 to 12 degrees into early next week, but temperatures will remain well above normal, with valley highs remaining in the 90s. This strong high pressure will not only continue to bring with it very hot temperatures, but also very dry air as well. Minimum humidity will be mainly in the upper single digits to around 20% above and inland from the shallow marine layer influence through early next week. The driest conditions will likely be today and Thursday, with slight improvement into the weekend. The marine layer will remain shallow through the period, with higher humidities limited to the immediate coastline. Poor overnight recoveries in the deserts and many mid and upper slopes will continue through the period under the hot and dry air mass, especially for tonight and Thursday night. You can see from this graphic the expansive area of overnight humidity of 30% or lower. The deserts will more likely remain under the 20% range overnight. Some modest improvement is possible into the weekend, but it will not be much. So we have the heat and we have the dryness, but what about the winds? The good news is that winds will remain mostly light overall. In order for a stronger Santa Ana wind event to materialize, we would need a trough of low pressure to move around the high pressure into the Great Basin and desert southwest, which you saw earlier we do not have. Through the period, there will be fairly persistent offshore winds, mostly across the higher terrain of southern and central California, like we're seeing this morning. The late morning and afternoon sea breezes will likely continue over the low elevations near the coast, but winds will likely remain offshore for most mountain areas prone to north to east winds. Maximum offshore wind gusts will be mostly 25 miles an hour or less, though isolated windier spots may gust to 35 miles an hour or more at times. These offshore winds will also not be limited to this typical Santa Ana wind corridor, but there will also be gusty, breezy offshore flow across the higher terrain of the central coast. Same thing applies though, gusts will be largely under 25 miles an hour. As a result of the very hot temperatures, dry air, and fairly breezy offshore winds, the National Weather Service has issued several red flag warnings across portions of the higher terrain of central and southern California. These are all in effect through Thursday evening in tandem with the hottest and driest conditions. Due to the heat, mixing heights will be very high, which will allow for the potential for any fire, new or existing, to exhibit dangerous plume-dominated fire behavior. So how do fuels look, you may be asking? The chart of 100-hour fuels for South Ops as a whole illustrates a very telling story. You remember that period of cooler and wetter weather we had a couple weeks ago that led to a sharp increase in dead fuel moistures? Well, now that is a distant memory, as the hot and dry conditions we are experiencing now have turned things right back around. Fuels have dried out significantly, and you can see in the green forecast line that fuels will likely be as dry as they were at the beginning of September when we had that wildfire outbreak, at least for 100-hour fuels and finer. Notice the gray line is a trend of the average fuel moisture during the climatology and illustrates that at this point of the year, fuel moisture should be increasing. This just goes to show how unusual this pattern is for early October. Live fuel moistures also remain at or near critical levels in many species, especially at or below 5,000 feet, and those will be falling in the coming days as well. To put it all together, the hot temperatures and continued dry weather will increase the threat for new large fires. Our area-wide new large fire probability has now increased back into the elevated level. For this time of year, these values are very high and it is highly unusual. The average daily large fire start probability in October is 5%, so we are much above normal for October. It is very unusual for this region to experience significant fire activity in the absence of strong offshore winds for this part of the season, but our hot and dry conditions could definitely support it considering the fuels conditions. Longer range forecasts indicate that warm and dry conditions will continue to be the theme as we go deeper into the fall. Even though we are still not seeing any significant offshore winds in the near future, we will always continue to keep an eye out for them. And that's all I have for today. Thanks for tuning in. Our next webcast will be on Thursday, October 3rd. Have a fantastic day.